and welcome to Always Take Notes.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pictures. Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the literary agent Carrie Plitt.
We spoke to Carrie about being an American in London and building her career as a literary agent, about representing Rennie Edo Lodge while her book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race became a huge hit, and her advice for young writers looking to secure representation.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it. Carrie, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's great to have you here. We wanted to start about your intro to literary agenting, but also where this fitted in with your transatlantic background. Is it right that you're American and you did your undergrad in the US and then came to the UK for a master's?
That's right. So I did my undergrad at Williams College, and I was really lucky to win a scholarship to go to Cambridge for 2 years, where I really thought I would be for 2 years. You know, my plan was to study there and go back. But at the time, there was this thing called a post-study work visa, and it meant you could apply for 2 years. You didn't have to have a job. And I had lots of friends who were moving to London. You know, I'd loved being in Cambridge, but it didn't feel like the full experience of being in the UK. And like most English grads, I was confused about what I wanted to do and didn't think there were a lot of options. And the kind of immediate option was publishing. You think, okay, I love books. I'll try to work in publishing. So that was where I started, really. I got that visa and then I started looking for jobs in the industry.
Do those visas still exist, or is it a bit harder now to stay on after study?
It's a good question. It changes every year, as far as I can tell. I think they've brought them back, actually, because they canceled them for a while, but that was super unpopular. And I believe some version of them still now exists. And it's a wonderful thing if you are studying over here and want to try to work in the UK, at least for a little bit of time.
And you were studying screen and media culture, I think. What did that involve?
It was a kind of multidisciplinary MA. So I was interested in film, you know, as a person who loved films, but I hadn't really studied it in the past. And one of the things I'd always been interested in was the intersection between visual culture and books and words. And I was an art history major for undergrad. So I thought that MA would be a really nice way to combine all of those things. I mean, quite honestly, I don't know that it gave me much besides the chance to write and think about films. It wasn't the best designed MA, but I met a lot of friends. I had a really fun time, and actually emerged from it thinking I would really like to work in books rather than film or TV. I loved the element of writing about novels within the MA, and all of the papers I wrote were kind of comparing books and films as well.
So when you left, how did you find the experience of applying for those jobs? It strikes me that the entry-level stuff is extremely oversubscribed and also, you know, pretty badly paid. How did you find the actual process of applying for it, and did you pick something up pretty easily?
No. What I did do very easily, and I want to be really open about this, is get an internship via my director of studies. And I think sadly that is still how things happen in the industry. I think it's changing a little bit. We at FBA have a paid internship now, and we try to really advertise that and get people who maybe don't have connections in the industry. But at that time, 15 years ago, it really was about the connections that you had. And my director of studies knew an editor at Atlantic Books, and they said, yes, you can come, intern with us for a month, unpaid. I think they paid my expenses. So I went and slept on my friend's couch in Islington, which was very uncomfortable. It was like one of those leather couches, so you didn't even really sink into it. But I absolutely loved working at Atlantic as an intern. I mean, it's a smaller company, which I think helped, and they were so welcoming to me. I remember the editorial assistants kind of took me aside and showed me how to brief covers, and I read a lot for all of the various editors. I did a lot of admin and made tea and things like that. I remember Carl Merlantes, who wrote this book called
Matterhorn, right?
Yeah, had just been published by Atlantic, and that had done really well. And he came into the office, and I had to go pick up the Matterhorn cake from Soho, from Bloomsbury. And I was too afraid to get a taxi because I didn't really understand how to expense it. So I ended up carrying this giant cake from Soho to Bloomsbury on a like London bus. I was sure I was going to drop it. And I remember I arrived in the office, and one of the editors immediately just put their hand through the cake, which was not my fault, but I felt relatively responsible. But anyway, that internship, when I finished that, I was sure that I wanted to work in publishing. But then it was a long process from there. I managed to get another internship at Fourth Estate via one of the editors there who recommended me, again, unpaid. And then I ran out of money, and I had to start doing a very soul destroying job in Chiswick, doing research about pharmaceutical companies. But all the time I was looking for publishing jobs. And it was not easy. I applied for a lot of jobs. I got shortlisted for a decent amount, but lost out a lot. I wasn't really sure what I was doing wrong, what people wanted. And it was a little demoralizing. I started to think, well, is this really the industry that I want to be in? And, am I going to get a job? And then I applied for a job in the rights department at Penguin, and actually had recommendations from a couple of people who I had applied for jobs with, but hadn't gotten the final job. And they recommended me to Chantal, which I think was one of the reasons that I ended up getting that job in the end. So, but that was a period of a number of months looking for work in the industry.
Could you explain just to some of our listeners who don't know what it means, what briefing covers means?
Yes, of course. And I didn't find this out until I started working at Atlantic. So when a book is written, there is a process by which the design department needs to design the cover, but the editor has some input into that because they will have been the one who spent all the time with the text. They might have an idea in their heads of what kind of book this is, what genre, the story it's telling, what they might want to communicate on the cover. So they will literally write a brief of, this is what the book is about, and this is what I think you might want to explore on the cover. It's pretty loose. Usually it's not, I want there to be a border of flowers and a mountain in the background. It's more, you might want to play with some of these symbols. You might want to communicate that this is super literary and experimental. Maybe you want to think about the figures or the setting. And so it's actually a very creative and interesting process, and it makes you really think about how book covers work and what they're doing and what they're saying. And it's always exciting too to see the brief that you've written or your colleague has written and how it comes out on the other side. And sometimes it's exactly what you had sort of envisaged, and sometimes it's completely different.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. And I imagine it's quite important to have that dialogue between the two because, as you say, the editors are the ones who've kind of worked and know the book most intimately. In that time that you were the rights assistant at Penguin, what was the kind of work that you were doing? I guess that set you up quite well for going into agenting.
Yeah, it was a great crash course in the work of publishing. And basically, for any listeners who don't know what rights is, it's a kind of catch-all term for any rights outside of the kind of English language book volume rights. And so rights departments will often cover things like translation rights is probably the most important thing and the term most often used when people talk about rights. But within Penguin, we were also covering things like serial rights. So when the book gets extracted around publication in a newspaper, we did some audio rights. We did large print rights. So we were working across a lot of different parts of the publishing industry. And I was the team assistant. So I was across a lot of those things. I mean, it really was a very heavy admin job is the truth of it. It was compiling databases of what newspaper editors had said about something, and selling production materials, which means that when foreign editors needed the photographs and pictures from the books that Penguin were publishing, I would be in charge of getting those from the art department and selling them to them for a price because we'd put together all of the files. I helped with submissions to foreign publishers in terms of logging them. It was one of those jobs where you have so much admin to do, but it's so piecemeal that it's hard to even describe what you're doing all day. And frankly, it was great. I loved the team, but it was so far away from books themselves that I started to question whether I wanted to be doing it for a long time pretty quickly into that job. I was not asked to read a book in my time there. I sort of started begging people to let me read books, and I found ways. I joined the Penguin Classics Club and made a lot of friends who were reading classics and everything like that. But it wasn't a big part of the job.
And was that paid properly, that job, or was it on a sort of miserable salary?
Well, it was a starting salary. I think it was like £21,000. So no, not really paid properly. I mean, I had no money. It was enough that I moved into an apartment with friends or a flat rather, as I had learned to call it by that time. And we, went out to cheap pubs, and it was a really fun thing for me to be in London and be working and have an adult professional life. But no, salaries were not high. It was not great.
We're not picking on you. We ask every guest on the podcast about money and how it works. So thank you for your sort of candor and straightforwardness.
It's so important to be open about money in our industry, and I think it's slowly changing. There's been a lot of pressure recently, but the salaries are still really low, and that is true not just for starting salaries. Actually, I think it's hard to make a lot of money in publishing unless you're at the very top.
Do you think that's changing at all with the discussions around diversity and broadening out the class pool that publishing is drawing on? Do you think that's changing, or is it sort of a more slow moving thing?
It's changing slowly. I think we are finally having the conversation about the fact that the low salaries in publishing are a barrier for people who don't, as you say, have money in their family, because it's really difficult to live on, and it's really hard to attract bright, young, interesting people from different backgrounds who just see that it's very hard to live, even years down the line. It's not as though, okay, you start on a small salary, but then you can work your way up and have a really comfortable life. And so it's changing a little bit. I mean, salaries were really, really stagnant in publishing until quite recently, and there's been a lot more pressure on the industry to raise starting salaries in particular. And I think actually Hachette and PRH to some extent are leading the charge. The corporates are doing a better job. It's still slow moving though, and it's a very competitive industry. And I think sometimes, publishers and agencies will say, okay, yes, we do want to make this easier, but the fact is they know that it's still pretty easy to hire people who are really keen to get in. And there's a big disparity between what the CEOs are making and what other people are making on their teams.
And then for you, how did the move out of that rights job into agenting and to Conville and Walsh, how did that come to pass? So
as I said, I started thinking pretty soon after starting the job about whether this is what I really wanted to do. And that job also allowed me to really understand the different parts of publishing and what everybody else does. And agenting wasn't something I was really aware of when I was studying. When I was thinking maybe I want to go work in publishing, what I really knew about was editing, because that's I suppose the public facing part of the industry. But the more I learned about agents, the more I thought, okay, maybe that's something I really want to do, because I liked that it's still very author facing. It's very focused on the text, actually. And I think we can get more into this, but I think one of the things people don't realize is how much work and editing agents do on text, in addition to the editors. I loved that it was it's a social job. I'm a pretty extroverted person. I like meeting people. I like talking to people about books, and that's what you have to do all the time as an agent. I like that there was an element of kind of business in it. I liked the idea that of selling books and sort of negotiating and being there as a champion for the author. So I liked that. I don't want to say individualistic because that sounds wrong. I love being part of a team, but I like as an agent, you're sort of in charge of your time and your client list, and you can shape the books that you represent in a really exciting way, in a way that even editors can't, I think, because they're a little constrained by their team and their imprint and things like that. So anyway, I thought, okay, yes, I think I want to be an agent. And I sort of started asking around people I knew in the industry, including an editor who I had interned with at Atlantic. And she knew that an agent named Jo Unwin, who at the time was at Compton Walsh, had been sort of looking for an assistant. So I met Jo. I really liked her. We really hit it off. And she said, I don't know that I'm quite, ready to have an assistant yet, but I've been thinking about it. So I sort of stored that in my mind. And I think it was 7 months from when I started at Penguin, Jo advertised for an assistant. It was actually an assistant for 3 days a week. But I was just so desperate at that point to get into agenting and to find something new. I interviewed for the job and they offered it to me, and I took it. And it was 18. I will say what the salary was. It was £18,000, but pro rata, so 3 days a week. So took it knowing that I would need to supplement that income in some way if I was only working 3 days a week.
What did you get a sort of something to do for the other 2 days a week, or did you do kind of like tutoring or something?
The finance director there, Alan, was very sweet. I said to him, listen, I can't, I'm going to need to do something else. And he sent an email out to a number of his contacts about me. And so I basically did odd jobs, some of which I already had myself. Like I was editing for this company in Ohio that was like a friend of a friend on their grant proposals. I ended up working for a woman who ran a sort of pottery studio out of her house, helping her organize things. I ended up helping another person get their house ready to put on Airbnb. I mean, it was very interesting and strange time, but yeah, it was. I got to know London, certainly, doing all of those different things.
These days they call it a portfolio career. It's fine.
And I really learned a lot from the pottery. That's going to serve me well.
In 2013, you became a junior literary agent. So I'm assuming that means you kind of started to build out your own list. How did that come about, and how did you find people to take on?
One of the things that happened was that Jo left Compton Walsh. So I assisted her for a little while. And when she left, I started assisting Patrick Walsh. And around that time as well, I started to say to Patrick and everyone at Compton Walsh, listen, I really want to start representing my own books. I feel I know how to be an assistant. I can do this job really well. And I think I've proven that I can start taking on my own list. And Patrick really kindly said, okay, yes, you can do that. And the thing about being an assistant and moving up to an agent is kind of understood that you just have to do it alongside your job as an assistant. And that's what I did. I continued to do all of my assisting roles, but I started to basically in my own time look for clients. And it was a combination of things. It was really looking through our submissions that we received. And, a few of my early authors actually came from unsolicited submissions that came in. And I still think of that as a really important part of our work as agents. It was also just emailing almost all of my contacts and saying, do you know someone who might want to write a book? And my director of studies once again came through because he sent somebody my way who was one of the first authors that I did a deal for. It was reading newspapers and magazines. I do mainly nonfiction, so things like Aeon and the FT and The Guardian, and just writing to people whose work I had liked, writing to academics whose work seemed interesting and like they wanted to write for a popular audience and saying, would you be interested in writing a book? And most of those things came to nothing, but some of them worked out. And that's sort of how I slowly started building a list. And that's still something I do. I mean, it's, I would say, less a part of my day-to-day work just because so many things come to me now and I have so many clients I have to manage. But it's still a really important part of the work is always looking for new clients.
And when you're making those early moves, how do you, as someone who had, you're also making your own first steps, how do you get writers to kind of trust you or things like that when you don't have a track record of having sold stuff before?
Yeah, I mean, it's harder. But I do think, and I would still say this to writers now, there are advantages to an early career agent or somebody who hasn't even sold a book yet. And especially if they're at a good agency, they have a supportive boss, because they will have a lot of experience of seeing what the process is like of selling a book. And if they are selling your book, they'll have, lots of professionals whose advice they can draw upon. But also, early career agents have the time to invest in your project, and they are committed, very, very committed to making your book work because, I now have a big list of clients and I'm totally devoted to them, but it's not a make or break thing when I send out a book rather. It's I'm hoping to sell everything that I send out, and I'm lucky that for the most part that I do. But I remember that pressure of early books where I wanted it to work. I wanted people to love it. And so I spent a lot of time and energy on the clients that I signed up in the first instance. And actually a lot of the early clients I've signed up are some of my most successful or prolific clients. I think that early relationship can be really, really, really fruitful. And so that was part of my pitch, basically. I'm really invested in making this work. You're one of my only clients. I will, stay up late editing your proposal on the weekends, and I need to make it work.
Do you feel that your sales approach or your sort of negotiation tactics have changed at all since those early days?
My sales approach. Well, I suppose as a more established agent, you have relationships with editors that you didn't have as a junior agent. I mean, I think our industry is relatively open to new agents, and they when I was sending things out, I never felt that people didn't want to hear from me or weren't interested. But things do change once you have a reputation for having relatively good projects and you've spent a lot of time with people, you've gotten to know them, you've gotten to know their taste. They trust your taste. They also trust that if you're sending them something, it's probably going to be relatively good. So I feel that it's easier for me to call up an editor and say, I think you're going to love this project. I couldn't do that as a junior agent. And so it was much more about really honing the pitch letter, really making sure that, I sent it at the right time, really tailoring it to what I thought that they knew. And so maybe that's what's changed.
And with this move that you made in 2016 to Felicity Bryan, is that quite a standard thing that you've kind of, you start as an assistant, you start taking on your own clients in the same environment, and then when you kind of really spread your wings, you move to another agency? Is that a pretty typical sequence?
It is. I mean, there are people, my former colleague, Sue Armstrong, started out as an intern at Conville and Walsh, and she's now a director of the company. So people definitely do start at an agency and move up there and stay there. At the same time, I think a lot of people do end up making that move simply because when you've been an assistant somewhere, it's harder to make a transition, I think, to a full agent. And actually, when I left Conville and Walsh, I was still doing some assisting things, and I was on the road to fully getting rid of my assisting duties and just representing clients. But when Felicity Bryan approached me, they said, we just want you to be an agent. We just want you to develop your list. And also we think, I think it is important sometimes for agents to do that because it just shifts your self-perception a bit. I didn't even realize that I still thought of myself as an assistant until I arrived at Felicity Bryan and everybody thought of me as an agent. And I don't think it's a mistake that that's when my career really started to fly when I arrived there, because I just felt like a different person. I felt like a different kind of agent.
I've heard that at some agencies, if you're in that kind of associate junior agent role, to make the step up to full agent, you have to have sort of hit particular financial benchmarks. Is that something that's standard in the industry, or have I sort of got a warped perception of it?
It totally depends on the agency, and it changes. I think the bigger the agency, the more likely that's going to be the case. It was not when I arrived at Felicity Bryan, I kept asking them about benchmarks and targets, and they were like, "We know you'll set your own goals. Like we believe in you," which was really lovely, but also terrifying. But they were right because I was desperate. I think sometimes what people don't realize about agents is we work only on commission. And if we're not selling enough books to earn commission, to earn back our salary a few times over, it's not worthwhile for us to be employed by an agency. That's the only income that we have. So it's really, really important that we make a certain amount of commission. And I really wanted to prove to Felicity Bryan that it had been worth their while hiring me. And I think that strategy worked much better than feeling the looming target every year.
Is there variance also between agencies on how the pay deal works? So, I mean, were you from what you're saying, so did you had a standard salary, but you were expected to make a multiple of it in commission, or were you literally on a commission only deal, or how does that tend to vary across industries?
It varies a little bit across the industry. I would say it varies a lot between America and the UK. Most agents in the UK are salaried, and then you make a bonus when you earn a certain amount times your salary, and then you make a percentage on top of that in terms of commission. In the US, there are a lot more commission-only agents. It's often structured like that. And that can actually be very lucrative once you start making a lot of money. It's tough early on in your career as an agent. And I feel really lucky that I was salaried from when I started, even though I wasn't necessarily immediately bringing in money.
Could we move on now to talk about some of the projects that you sent over? So could we start with In Pursuit of Memory? If you tell us a little bit about the kind of genesis of that project, how it sort of took shape, and then sort of selling it and it getting published as well.
So I wanted to include that because it was one of the first books that I sold, and I sold it while I was still working at Compel and Walsh. And it came unsolicited. People call it the slush pile. I don't like to call it that because it sounds pejorative. But Joe was a young neuroscientist working at UCL, and he had this idea. He'd been working on Alzheimer's, and he noticed that there weren't any books that were kind of telling the story of the science of Alzheimer's and what's actually happening in the brain. And he thought he would be really well placed to write that. And he felt very passionate about it too, because his grandfather had died of Alzheimer's and he had sort of witnessed the disease firsthand. And he sent in quite a short proposal I think, I can't remember whether it was to the company or to me directly. I can't remember exactly what we were doing in terms of submissions at that time, but I immediately seized on it and I thought, okay, I think this could be really interesting. And, we had that whole discussion where I said, I'm going to spend all my time on what you're doing. And I'm at this great agency and, I'm ready to make the step up. And then we spent a lot of time on the proposal, getting it right. I think I had him write a sample chapter and then we edited it quite a few times. We worked really hard on getting the narrative right in the proposal and making sure all of the ideas were really clear, making sure that it was a very human story of a disease. So you had the science and you had the neuroscience in there, but it was also about people, including scientists, but also his family, also patients dealing with Alzheimer's and their families. Once we had the proposal ready, I sent it out, and I believe it was also my first auction, which was very exciting, which means that there were multiple publishers bidding on the book. And I remember Georgina Laycock, who eventually bought it for John Murray. I remember her calling me. She read it very, very quickly and tried to preempt the book. So she tried to offer a certain amount of money to take it off the table before we went to auction. But I had enough publishers who were interested that I turned down the preempt, and then we had a nice auction. We met all the publishers, and then Joe did eventually decide to go with John Murray. But that was a really exciting period for me. I felt that, to have identified this book as something that could work, to get Joe to trust me with his work, to help him develop. I mean, he's a great writer, but I felt that we developed his prose together. And that was really exciting. And then kind of to see the fruits of that and have him land with a really exciting publisher, that was so gratifying. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about being an agent is helping shepherd writers through that process and really adding value to what they can do and placing them with brilliant publishers.
Just on another kind of technicalities point, I mean, do you think there are situations where it's worth taking a preempt offer? Because it seems, I mean, I've been on the receiving end of it, and it's my read of the kind of psychology of it is if someone is trying to preempt it, the chances are pretty good that someone else is going to want it as well. And if you, as you did in that situation, if you hold your nerve and see it through, then you are likely to get more money with relatively little risk. Or do you think it's more nuanced than that?
It's a little more nuanced. I tend to turn down preempts because, as you say, if somebody is that keen on a book, there likely are other people who are keen. But that's not always the case. And sometimes it is just the right publisher. And they're offering such a appealing sum of money that it really does make sense to take it off the table. So I've accepted preempts as well. And it will also, it is kind of a feeling, right? It's like, what's the mood? What's the attitude? If I have tons of people calling me, telling me how much they like a proposal, there's a good chance I'm going to turn down a preempt. If there's just one publisher who's super, super keen and everyone's a little bit unsure, haven't shared with their teams yet, then it's more of a discussion with the author. It also obviously is always up to the author in those situations. And I would say it's a risk to turn down a preempt because you don't know that other people are going to come in. You don't know that you're going to get back up to that level. And so I think ultimately, I can advise based upon my expertise, but the author might say, well, I love this publisher. That's the kind of level I'm really happy with. I think let's go with it.
I mean, also presumably with a preempt, if there is a bidding war that doesn't, if you turn it down, it doesn't preclude that publisher coming back in to bid again.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And that they can go up to that level then. So it's, but again, they will only go up to that level if there's somebody bidding against them who's willing to go that high. So it's really, as an agent, you're always thinking about, okay, who's in, what can they pay? How excited do they seem about this? What books have they bought recently? Do they have a slot for this? All of those things. And that's what I'm always trying to think about in those kinds of situations.
And another kind of technical question, but on this more on a sort of editorial or structural point. With that book, you talk about the fusion of the author's own story of his grandfather and the broader science. Do you think, I mean, that's quite a common tool, I suppose, in nonfiction. Do you think is it necessary, or is it one of a number of approaches amongst others, or did you encourage him to do that?
I don't think it's necessary by any means. And I think there's plenty of nonfiction that, I just read Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe, and he's not in that book. And it's not, I think that would have been a worse book if he was like, and then I thought about my family who had gone through this issue. It's great because it's really excellent narrative investigative journalism. But I do think it can help. When I'm reading nonfiction, what I'm looking for is some kind of thread that takes me through the story. And that can be different things. But one of the ways that it allows me as a reader to really connect with something, if I see that the author has an investment in it. And in this case, it felt that Joe's family story was so essential to the telling of this story because it's what had inspired him to do the research he was doing. It showed that he had, I think, especially with medical things, doctors or scientists or clinicians, can sometimes kind of have a cold approach to things. But, Alzheimer's is this disease that so many people deal with themselves or in their family. And I think I encouraged Joe to go even more in that direction because I felt that it would make him a much more sympathetic and also knowledgeable guide to the topic.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess with medical books in particular, that kind of approach can yield dividends. Could we move on to another project you sent over, which is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race? When you took on Rennie Adelodge as a client, was that, based in that blog post that she wrote in 2014?
So that is a slightly different roundabout route of representation. And I brought that in partially because I wanted to show the strange ways that agents end up taking on clients and how these things work. So Rennie signed up with a different agent who sold that book to Bloomsbury. And I had a meeting with Alexa von Hirschberg, who's Rennie's editor. And she said, I'm publishing this book in June. It's amazing. You have to read it. And she gave me a copy. And I read it and I thought, okay, this is totally amazing. And I host a podcast called Literary Friction. And I thought, okay, I really need to get Rennie on the podcast. So I wrote to Alexa. We set that up with Rennie's publicist at Bloomsbury. And she came in and did an interview pre-publication. And it was great. She was amazing. She was great at talking about the book. And we were just chatting afterwards. And she said, actually, I'm looking for a new agent and I'm having meetings today with potential agents. And I said, I'm an agent. Can we have a meeting? And so we arranged a meeting there, and she was talking to a lot of different people, but I was so lucky that she chose to go with me. And so when the book was published, I was her agent. And one of the things, because another agent had sold that book, that contract is with that agent. But that agent hadn't sent the book out internationally at all. And that's coming back to rights, actually. One of the very important things that we do as agents is handle translation rights for books a lot of the time. So in France and Japan, et cetera, via co-agents or on our teams themselves. And I thought, okay, this book, it's about Britain, but it's about so much more than that. And so we did, 10 translation right sales for the book. And part of that was on the back of the fact that it was kind of an instant sensation in the UK. But I was really proud that I took Rennie on and sort of helped her become even bigger in a way.
Without breaking confidences, but was that failure to send it out internationally, was that the main reason that she was looking for a new agent, or did you sense there were other factors in the mix?
I sensed there were some other factors. Maybe her former agent was not the most engaged person in the world, but yeah, I don't think I should say more.
Fair enough. When you had that when you were one of those agents pitching to her, though, because it was quite short notice, how did you sort of present yourself? I mean, normally, I guess if you were in that situation, you would sort of do your research, you'd work out how you'd position yourself. How did you, pitch yourself to her? Was it just a case of, I'll work really hard, as you said before, or was it something else?
Well, at that stage, it's a slightly different thing, isn't it? Because it's not, I'm gonna make your proposal amazing. I think it's like, what can I add in terms of value? And part of it was about foreign rights. I think it really helped that I had read the book and been super enthusiastic about it and had already sort of really thought carefully about it to prepare for an interview with her. So I was very engaged with the ideas within the book. Yeah, so I think it was a combination of real enthusiasm for her work, but also thinking about how to position her as a writer. And, it's hard for me to know why she chose to go with me, and I can't possibly speculate, but I think actually, I think it's a combination of really thinking about, my dedication to her and fighting for her, because, the other thing that was really, and I think she would be fine with me saying this, becoming a sensation as an author is a wonderful thing, but it's also a very exposing thing. And I think she really needed someone who could think through that transition with her. And I hope part of one of the reasons why she chose to go with me too is she felt that she had somebody who was a real ally through the process.
And that experience of agenting a sensation book must also have been a transition for you in some ways, right? Presumably as well. I mean, how did it affect your standing both within the agency you were working in and more widely in the industry?
Well, within my agency, I mean, I think people were just happy that I had a book that was doing well and an author that people really respected. And, by that time, it wasn't as though I didn't have any clients already. So I'd sort of established myself pretty well. But yeah, it does. It's helpful to have a book that sells really well because it becomes a calling card. when you meet editors, you can say, okay, I represent this book. And then they have a sense that you're someone that they have to take seriously.
And can we move on now to the last of the three titles you sent over, Conversations on Love by Natasha Lunn. Am I right in thinking that started out with a newsletter?
It did, yeah. And that's a nice story of taking on an author, again, in a kind of roundabout way. I had my friend said, I've been reading this newsletter called Conversations on Love. It's so good. And I subscribed and I started reading it. And I just thought Natasha had this really intense and thoughtful and earnest, but not at all cloying way of talking about love and interviewing people about love. At the time, it was just a newsletter where she interviewed various people about love, like Hilary Mantel. But the questions she asked and the things she got out of people just opened up so many areas of inquiry that I thought were really serious. You know, they were really, they were thinking very, very thoughtfully and seriously about love. And so I wrote to her and I said, have you thought about a book? And again, I think she was talking to a few other agents, but I actually, the first time we planned our meeting, I was really sick and I couldn't go and meet her. And I was so sad about it. And I wrote her this really long email saying, like, I'm so sorry. I really want to meet you. And she was lovely. And we rescheduled. And then when we met, I think it just clicked, you know, and we started talking about what the book might be. And she got in touch and said, yes, I'd love to be represented by you. And then together we came up with the structure of the proposal. We thought through how the proposal would work, how a newsletter of interviews becomes a book, because I don't think that's an obvious transition. But that was a really wonderful, fruitful experience. And then again, we had a big auction for the book, and I was so happy for Natasha. And then the book became a bestseller. So, you know, not all, I feel I've picked books that were all sort of case studies of when things work. And I think I should say that not everything is a huge auction, and that's okay. And I don't want to represent my career as just like doing auctions all the time, but Conversations on Love is, I think, a great example of just how things work out at every step of the way.
Were the big name contributors, so people like Candice Carter-Williams, Dolly Alderton, and so forth, were they on board at the stage the book was sold? And then what was the process of kind of wrangling them and getting them involved in the project like?
I think Natasha had secured a few people who she'd already interviewed in the newsletter who said they'd be willing to be re-interviewed. So we could say, okay, these people are already on board. But a lot of it was people she hoped to interview. And Natasha is brilliant at writing love letters to people about how much she loves their work and loves them and would love to interview them. And I mean, she sent a lot out. Definitely a lot didn't come back. It's sort of the same as my work as an agent in some ways, you know, getting in touch with lots of writers, seeing if they'd be interested in something, and then seeing who comes back. But a lot of those interviews were secured after we did the deal with Viking Penguin.
It's some kind of, I wanted to ask some sort of broader questions, and particularly because a lot of our listeners are aspirant writers or people at the beginning of their career. And just touching on a couple of things that you mentioned previously about the relative merits of a kind of young, hungry agent versus someone who's older and has less time for you, and then also this question of you know, engagement from an agent's side. I mean, if you're starting out in your early 20s or so forth, and you're beginning to engage with the literary industry for the first time, how do you know? What do you think the things that someone should look for in a interaction with an agent is? What are the good signs, and then what also are any red flags if there are such things?
Yeah, I think it is partially about the reputation of the agency. So it's worth seeing what other clients they represent, if they're respected within the industry, if they have clients on their books that you've heard about. And it doesn't have to be just that agent. It can just be the wider agency itself. I do think that it's okay to have an agent who's more established, and they have their, you know, that grants them a certain kind of clout within the industry, that can be very useful if they're saying, I found this new writer who I'm incredibly excited about. You have to drop everything and read what they've written. They can do that. So I don't think that if you're young, you have to go with a young, hungry agent who doesn't have that many clients, but it's worth thinking about. In terms of things to look out for and red flags, I think first and foremost, look out for somebody who actually loves your work and has ideas about how to improve it. I think if somebody says to you, yes, this is great, I'm going to send it out and it doesn't need anything, maybe that's true, but it also might mean that they're not totally invested in it and they're kind of chancing it. And I think any good agent will want to do a little bit of editorial work on your book, whether it's a nonfiction proposal or a novel. I think it's really, it is a kind of chemistry thing. I think it's really about clicking, and it's really important if there's an agent who wants to represent you or wants to have a chat, to meet them and just see how you get along with them. See if you agree with them. See if there's somebody who you think you don't mind giving you bad news, because that's probably going to happen. Are you afraid to pick up the phone to them? Are you afraid to tell them that you're stressed about something? That's probably not a good thing. So really think, like, can I get along with this person? Do I want to have a pretty close relationship with them? Do I trust them? It's hard to tell those things from a first meeting, but I do think you get a sense. It's kind of like dating. You get a sense for somebody and what they do. And also, how would I sit on their list? Do they represent other things that are like this? Would this be the first kind of book that they're doing in this category? What are they saying they're going to put into helping me bring the book to market? Are they interested long term, or is it just for this book? Think about, are they invested in the long term, and will they have time for me, basically?
And a general kind of question about sort of your routine. I mean, how many clients do you have, if you can think of the number off the top of your head? And how is your week kind of organized between the various different parts of the role that you do as an agent?
People ask me this all the time, and I somehow never check how many clients I have, even though I get the question. I mean, it must be in the 60s or 70s now, which sounds very daunting, but actually, that you will both know that the life of the writer is, they don't always need to be in touch with their agent all the time. A lot of my clients are off writing their books, and maybe I'll hear from them once in a while, checking in, saying, okay, I'm still writing my book, or, what do you think about this? But we're not in touch every day. And the time when you're in touch more with authors is when you're developing new ideas, when their book's about to be published, and you're sort of in touch with publicity, things like when they're designing the covers. So I think there's always clients who require more of my attention at different times. And in terms of how my week is organized, one of the great things about being an agent is it's super varied. So this week I was in London. So I'm based in Oxford, but I'm in London a couple of days a week. I was in London yesterday. I had lunch with one of my clients. I went to a prize giving ceremony for a journalism prize that I helped to administer. I met a couple of editors who I hadn't caught up with in a while to get a sense of what they're doing. I met a prospective author who I'm trying to take on, and we're having conversations about that. So that's part of what I do. But it's also, emailing a lot of the time, as is true with most office jobs. And that emailing is everything from, a cover design that's come in that they want to check with the author, to checking on publicity plans, to trying to see what stage a manuscript is at, to checking in with one of my authors who I haven't heard with for a while, to getting in touch with possible new clients. With email, it's like, I don't know how I spend so much time doing it, but I definitely takes up a big portion of my day. But I also, this week, I looked over a few contracts for my clients. That's a big part of what we do, negotiating contracts. I was negotiating some deal memos. I've also I have a US co-agent I work with who has one of my clients' books on submission, and we just had the best bids yesterday. So we were talking through what the best bid to take was. I'm sure there are so many things I'm missing out, but you'll see that, it is multitasking. And of course, I'm doing reading on top of that. So that tends to be outside of working hours, reading and editing proposals. But I do sometimes do that on Fridays, for instance. I often try to take time to read submissions that have come in or edit some of my clients' proposals that I'm working on.
Just kind of thinking about the way that agents are incentivized, and not just yourself, but more widely, is there a risk of getting spread too thin, given that you kind of eat what you kill in terms of deals that you can do, and that there is an incentive to have perhaps as much stuff going through at a cost of the amount of time you can give to individual clients?
Yeah, I'm aware of that possibility. And I think my approach to it as an agent is I'm pretty picky about the projects and the authors that I take on, because I'm not thinking about it just in terms of that project, but okay, I am planning to represent this author for their career. And do I think that they can have a long career as a writer? So that's how I try to avoid that problem. I think, there would be another way of agenting where you're just taking on as many projects as possible and sending them out and seeing if they stick. But I don't think that's a very good way to take care of your clients. And, part of our job is of course, we work on commission and we need to earn that commission, but that I see the most important part of the work I do is supporting my authors. And that might be doing a small deal for their second book with a small publisher in the hopes that it will take off. It's not immediate hit of money, but I'm doing it because I believe in their writing and I want the best for them.
And I guess that comes back to that thing of career management as well. It's not just about the kind of churn, it's also about positioning authors in a certain way. We're coming towards the end of our time, and so a final question from me is about Literary Friction, your writing podcast. Could you tell us a little bit about the origin of that, and how it's kind of developed and had all of its success?
Yeah, well, the origin, it was a long time ago when NTS, which is an online radio station, was setting up in East London, and they were looking for somebody to host a literature show in a sort of rotating arts live show called Kiss My Arts. And a friend of a friend knew somebody. I was interested, and they let me do it for some reason. I don't know. I had no experience. And it was probably very terrible. I don't want to listen back to those early live episodes. Things definitely went wrong. I at one point I flipped the wrong switch and just missed an entire interview. There was just dead air on I think that was the first ever episode that I did. But I loved doing it, and I realized pretty quickly that I really liked doing it with other people. And I had a friend, Octavia Bright, who was an academic and writer, who kept coming on, and we loved doing it together. We had a really great energy, and eventually I asked her to co-host it with me. Then it broke off from Kiss My Arts and became its own thing on NTS, but it was still just on NTS, the radio station. But then eventually we decided let's make a podcast out of this, and let's call it Literary Friction. And so Literary Friction was born, and that was 8 years ago now, possibly more. It's been going for a while. It used to be a monthly show in which we interviewed an author, and then had a discussion about a theme that arose from their book and recommended some books. So it was kind of like a magazine thematic format. So, we interviewed Zadie Smith and we talked about Cities of Voices, or we interviewed Dolly Alderton. We talked about friendship. We interviewed, when we interviewed Rennie, we talked about race in Britain. Atessa Moshfagh, we talked about rest and relaxation, etc. And then we started to expand it from there as a podcast. So now we do these mini-sodes that are just Octavia and I discussing topics and sort of other cultural recommendations. And then we set up a Patreon. And so now we also do special Patreon episodes. And it really organically grew. I mean, when we started, I doubt we had very many listeners. And now we get tens of thousands of listeners for every show, which still baffles me. I mean, I'm sure you both have this when I'm speaking into the mic when we're recording. I just think it's me and the author and Octavia. And then I'm like, oh my God, like 15,000 people are listening to this, which is very strange.
And as a final question from me, do you see yourself now firmly based in the UK, or do you think that you and your agenting work might go back to the US?
I feel very settled in the UK right now. It feels like my home. I've been here for 15 years now. I love working at Felicity Bryan Associates. One of the nice things about the work that I do is a lot of my clients' books sell in the US. I have a lot of business in the US, so I have a reason to go back to New York a lot. But most of my clients are British. You know, I feel very entrenched in the UK side of things, and I like it here.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Carrie, for your time and for talking so openly, and wishing you and your clients all the very best going forward. That was the Always Take Notes interview with Carrie Plitt. You can find her on Twitter at PlittyC, and you can find Literary Friction on Twitter as well at SlitFriction. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Carrie?
I really like these interview with agents that we're doing increasingly, because I think it's just an opportunity to kind of lift the lid on what goes on and to ask lots of nosy questions that writers don't always get to know. But I thought, fascinating to get that sense of what writing a bestseller experience was like as an agent. We've had a lot of discussion on the show about what that experience is like for writers, but very interesting to see how it worked, and also what I thought she was saying about her kind of duty of care responsibilities for Renée Edo-Lodge when that was going on. And just the kind of sense of how it works from an agent's perspective, because obviously these are people who are such crucial figures in writers' lives, but they don't necessarily get interviewed or talk in the same way. What about you, Rachel? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. And I think she was really interesting and offered a different perspective on the benefits of having an agent sort of early on in their career, and the energy that they could, and enthusiasm and care that they could bring to the client in their work. I resonated with quite a lot of what she said, but about sleeping on the floor when she was trying to make it in publishing, because I did that for a while. And also when she talked about the embarrassment of remembering that people actually listen to the podcast that she makes, because I always forget that too, and I think it's a conversation that we're having with people. And then I was at a party recently and someone said that they'd listened to an episode, and it was quite strange. Anyway, what have you been up to?
I'm in my last week in the Alps, so I'm doing kind of complicated pieces of logistics before flying home on Sunday. Rachel, what about you?
I have been sort of trying to put some logistics together for a trip, hopefully to Los Angeles to do some reporting. So that would be good.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
Can you say who or what you would be reporting on?
I don't want to in case it falls through and then it's embarrassing. So hopefully I will get to tell you about it soon. But yeah, that's what I've been up to.
Very exciting. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Akam.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. We're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there and Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.